Welcome everyone to this conversation with Davis Cook. Davis is the CEO of the Research Institute for Innovation and Sustainability. RIIS is the largest innovation-focused advisory firm in Africa, focused on innovation, ecosystem development, long-term scenario planning, and strategy execution. His work at RIIS is helping to build major innovation ecosystems in mining, marine energy, and of course, space industries across Africa. We really appreciate RIIS for their partnership and support for ASLI. As we all know, ASLI is arguably Africa's first space-focused think tank. And the core of ASLI, whether you look at it from the mission or vision, is for African institutions to be able to make informed decisions, evidence-based decisions. And that's part of why we are having this event, to look back in the past year, 2023, different activities, different programs, different initiatives that came up, and to have a kind of some form of analysis or a systems view of what happened last year, with the hope of getting some lessons from there. So generally, we'll be discussing space development in Africa, both at organizational level, national level, continental level, and of course, from there we can have like a peep into this year, what to expect this year. In terms of structure, the way we will go about the program, if we can mute, that'll be really fine. If we can mute ourselves. Yeah, so I'll allow Davis to start off with kind of a bird's eye view, like 15 to 20 minutes to speak generally about his thoughts, his observations about space development in Africa in the past year. And then after his talk, I will pose some questions to him. And of course, we all can it's going to be an interactive program. So while he's talking, you can send in any thoughts or questions in the chat box. But we are also happy to have you speak so that we interact with Davis. Once again, we are all welcome. Thanks, Davis, and I hand over to you.
Hello all. I see colleagues and friends from all over the world, which is great. To chat a little bit about some of the stuff that we've been seeing here. I wanted to spend a little bit of time reflecting on the highlights for me of things that have happened across the kind of African space sector over the last year. I think there's too much that has happened to go into depth on all of these. But I hope that some of these real remarkable points will showcase some of the exciting things that are happening and give a sense of the growth that's happening across the continent. So very happy to talk about this, and of course we can get into a lot more detail in the conversation later. But these are just a few of my favorite moments that we've seen over the course of the last year. So I want to kind of talk about this across 7 kind of like bigger topics. So the one is around understanding what's happening at an industry level, and that includes the entire industry value chain from launch and kind of satellite manufacturing, subsystems and all that kind of stuff, through to downlink, midstream, and then all the way onto the application side of the world. I think it's important to talk about some of the institutional changes that have happened in terms of governance, in terms of multilateral institutional relationships that have emerged. Of course, there's an important component related to the development of space sciences, right? So not just on the industry side, but what is happening at a scientific and a research perspective. There's a lot of growth that we've seen at a kind of in sector development. So this is not necessarily only looking at the achievements of individual firms within industry, but how is the overarching kind of industrial landscape and sector landscape changing over time. Of course, something close to our heart is around entrepreneurship, and talking about some of the really great evolutions that we've started to see in space tech related startups across the continent. I think we'd be remiss not to talk about the excellent activities that are happening from a youth perspective. Certainly one of the concerns in many parts of the world is that the talent in the space sector is aging out. But we've seen some really excellent and amazing responses from African youth that are interested in space. So, that for me is another kind of topic. And then lastly, something that I don't think gets enough airtime in relation to the space sector is the human social aspect of space. So looking at certain kind of cultural topics and really seeing how that's kind of evolved. So these are the big kind of 7 buckets that I have been inspiring for me about the space sector over the last year. I'm sure there are things that I'm going to miss, and I hope that other people have had different highlights, and it would be great to understand what those are. And so, we get a much richer view of what's been happening. So I think for me, one of the most exciting starting points for space last year was the launch around this time, actually, of the first, globally, the first agriculture-focused constellation, which was launched by Dragonfly. They're a South African satellite manufacturer that went up on a Falcon 9 launch. And so, having a kind of leading, fully designed, built, and operated African satellite, which is a world first, I think for me says a lot about what we are capable of, not just in South Africa, but globally. So the EOSat has been providing a number of kind of useful kind of data points for end users and forms part of this much bigger constellation. There are, of course, a number of other launches that took place last year. There were a couple of launches coming out of Egypt, but those are kind of like bigger systems, the same as South Africa. But if you also start considering the smaller launches that took place, Kenya put up with Sayari satellite. There were a couple of other CubeSats that went up from Zambia, from Zim. We're starting to see a number of nations taking these first steps. And we're not, we are not alone in this. So only a couple of months ago, Ireland, which is, in many respects, a much more, advanced economy than many places in Africa, also put up their first CubeSat. So, we may be further behind some nations, but I think collectively we have a lot of these skills and competencies. And so for me, there's been a lot of really exciting industry development here. Other things that I think are really, exciting for me was around the launch of the assembly integration and testing facility in Egypt. That I think is a real game changer for us to now be undertaking full AIT up to, I think, 1,000 kilos. And so that kind of gives us 2 facilities. One, of course, in Egypt. The second capability is in South Africa at the old HOTEC, which South Africa has been upgrading as part of their $300 million space infrastructure hub. So, Cape to Cairo, 2 ends of this facility. There's also been some great work being done. So there's some ground stations that, we're seeing being established in East Africa, in Rwanda. And when we, look at the application area, of course, there are significant, progress being done by groups such as Digital Earth Africa, RCMRD, GMES in Africa, all looking to build out these kind of application areas. So, hundreds, thousands of people working across the whole continent on this, and really building out our industry capabilities. But to have a world first constellation, I think is a real notable highlight for me in this sector. At an institutional level, the African Space Agency, which was promulgated, several years ago, kind of really started taking shape over the course of the last year. I think that it is a really ambitious program, and there are kind of many hurdles that they're going to have to overcome as we build out this kind of Pan-African capability. But I think that having this kind of agency that is able to coordinate and inform has the potential to really kind of develop a lot of excellent outcomes across the region. So, the ASA, I think, is a real highlight for me in terms of its own evolution. But there's a lot of other stuff that we've started seeing. So a number of countries have, for example, joined in the US's Artemis program. Nigeria, Rwanda, Angola certainly have signed up. And there's kind of like international collaboration at the space level for one of, what is going to be humanity's biggest scientific and technological endeavors is a really important step. There are other great relationships that are being built. So Roscosmos, for example, supported the development of the African Weather Space Center in Hermanus. And there are a number of other bilateral engagements that have been done between African countries in the UAE, together with Saudi, and then also further afield, looking at some of the support that we've seen from JAXA and various Chinese agencies. So I think that our institutional foundations are becoming more mature. And I think that this is really important because it gives us the opportunity to build out a well-regulated, well-managed system, which is simply not possible when these agencies don't exist. So this, I think, is a really positive step. In terms of science, of course, there's some remarkable work that's been done. Some of the first black hole images, which of course were from previous years, came out of the SKA, but we finally saw the SKA starting to form its kind of like final organizational structure. And, this is, one of the biggest science programs globally. We had new nations such as Canada joining into this. So this for me is a real diamond in terms of like what we are producing across the continent. Of course, there are a number of other science-related programs. We've seen, in terms of research being done by a number of universities in Egypt, in Tunisia, Nigeria, some excellent kind of scientific analysis being done here. I think also, it's important to note groups such as All Nations University in Ghana recently joining the International Astronautical Federation's IAF. And again, I think this is a really kind of powerful move to entrench and embed the space sector within the region. Again, like the establishment of an aerospace-focused university in Cairo is another example of the development of the prioritization of science and technology into the local ecosystem. So I think this is, another big highlight for me. So if we start talking about the way that we've been kind of building relationships and establishing partnerships at a kind of bigger region. So this here was part of the UK Africa Space Tour that was supported by the UK FCDO. We had delegates from Kenya, Rwanda, and South Africa across the entire spectrum, and Nigeria, all of whom were involved in the tour to the UK and building a number of stronger relationships there. And I think what's emblematic for me here is, firstly, the interest that we have seen in building relationships with Africa. And of course, we all know that Africa has a number of significant advantages in the space sector from a geographic and a technical perspective. If you start thinking about this from launch capabilities, there are east-facing equatorial coastlines in Africa that are optimal for launch. There's also a significant talent pool. And if you look at this from an industrial perspective, when you're looking at, for example, like the manufacturing side of the space value chain, we have access to cheap capital, cheap land, cheap labor relative to, for example, the UK or Europe. And so some of these relationships are really around how do we build these globally integrated space value chains. And this tour here into the UK was one example of that. And, we think we're going to see a lot more of these interactions taking place over the coming years as the industry continues to develop. I'd mentioned this previously. This is a topic close to my heart. So these are the three winners of one of the bigger flagship startup programs across Africa, the Africa Earth Observation Challenge, which is run by one of our kind of partner organizations. So, when we started this program, so this was originally established by South African Space Agency back in 2015. We had about a dozen applicants from South Africa alone. And the maturity of the startups was really quite limited. What we're seeing now, so the three winners here, one is out of Ghana, the second out of Egypt, and the third out of Niger, which are building some really remarkable technology stacks using satellite and space-based platforms to inform a number of end consumer services. So just to give like an idea here, the team that won the SNU code are developing a kind of unique location-based service for last mile logistics that has been integrating both observation and positioning data. The team out of Egypt, Z3RI, have been integrating satellite data for precision ag into a really interesting cell insurance and financing model for smallholder farms across the region. And the team out of Niger is building a tech stack integrating drone and satellite data to also support precision agriculture in a very different way. So what we're seeing now is, last year there were, applicants from nearly 30 countries. And so if you look at this trajectory, 7-8 years ago, we had maybe only a dozen space tech startups. Now we're seeing, easily 100 applicants a year into this program, and there are several hundred other applicants that, work through different activities. Not directly through this program, but I'm aware of groups such as Amini, which is a Seraphim Space Capital-backed startup that raised $4 million US as a series round towards the end of last year, based out of Kenya. So we're really seeing this recognition that the African entrepreneur environment is really kind of blossoming. And that tracks both with performance of the African startup economy, also the development and the maturity of the space entrepreneurs within that community who are starting to add some real value into the sector. So this image is from the 7th Space Generation Advisory Council Africa session that took place in Zim last year, in Harare. So here we had, I think there were delegates from 9 or 10 countries across Africa, around about 100 delegates, all coming in as youth to talk about the role that space can play for them and their respective countries. So this was the first time that there was a kind of multidisciplinary gathering of this type. So it did touch on some of the engineering aspects of space, but there were discussions around space law and policy. There were discussions around the economics of the industry. So it went beyond just the traditional engineering component into social sciences, into humanities. And I think these are really important shifts in the thinking of young people, that space is not just about engineering, but that there is an entire sector around this that's really important. So this was a remarkable kind of effort from the SGAC team, following on the success of the previous team in Rico the year before, but really an amazing opportunity to encourage more young people to actively participate in the space sector. And then maybe just to end off, so this is a screen grab out of Nexus Nairobi, which took place in Nairobi in sort of, I think, February of last year. So this was an event that was about the human aspect of space. And I think something that we often tend to forget is that we as people are inspired by space. Some of us are inspired by the math and the engineering, but I think many of us are inspired by the human stories that we see, by science fiction, by culture, by history, by art, by all these other things around space that are not always given sufficient visibility and airtime. So Nexus Nairobi was one example of this. I think it was an excellent kind of showcase for this, and will be happening again in a couple of months. Another kind of really remarkable thing, there is a podcast released by Arizona State University called Galaxies and Griots, which hosts these interviews with African speculative fiction authors. And some of these people are talking about, redefining, science fiction away from a very American gung-ho style idea into like, what does it mean to place, indigenous people at the center of science fiction and space-related stories, of Africans, of other people who have traditionally been excluded from many of these narratives. And so firstly, it's great science fiction when you read it, but it's also making sure that we are building an inclusive and much more welcoming space that, of course, enables people to see themselves in these industries in future. And so one of the things I hope you'll have noticed from these images that I shared is that in the majority of them, there are people. And I think this, for me, is one of the most kind of exciting outcomes, if I just sort of close out, for what I've seen happening over the African space ecosystem, is how collaborative we're seeing the local community starting to behave. So, just this morning I was on a kind of WhatsApp conversation with one of the people out of Tunisia. They are running a joint hackathon with a team out of Rwanda. And so we're seeing that these regions and these countries that are thousands of kilometers apart are working together to build this cohesive, inclusive space ecosystem. And I think that shift of doing things together will really stand us in good stead as a continent as we continue to develop. So that's kind of, for me, the highlights of the space kind of ecosystem for last year. There are many other things that we could definitely have added. And I'd love to talk about what your experiences were, and also sort of get into some discussion about what the future looks like. Tim, back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Davis, for that general overview. Thanks very much. You were able to go from across the spectra. Interestingly, as we are meeting right now, the PRC, that's the Permanent Representative Council of the African Union, they started meeting 2 days ago in preparation for the AU Summit, which is coming up mid next month. And of course, one of the agenda items usually on the table is always Agenda 2063. And in Agenda 2063, there are these flagship projects, and the African Outer Space Program is definitely one of them. So, I don't know everybody that is here, but I won't be surprised if they are either listening now or maybe they'll have access to listen to this later. So you've gone generally bedside view across board, but in terms of specifics or in terms of numbers, if you have numbers, how will you describe what's going on in the ecosystem, specifically in the private sector, in government, public sector? If you have any numbers or specifics.
Yeah. So I think that the key to think about this is over a slightly longer time period, not just last year, but like where were we last year compared to, say, 5 years ago? So at an agency level, pre-COVID, 2017, 16, around there were half a dozen space agencies across the continent. Now we're sitting at 16. I see Senegal, has recently, announced the establishment of an agency. So, in a very short period of time, we have tripled the number of institutional structures in the space sector across Africa. I think that is remarkable, and that is going to continue, right? So, my expectation is that over the next 3 years, we're going to go from 15 odd to 25 agencies, operating across the continent. Now, having an agency does not mean that you have a space program, right? In terms of like what we would traditionally understand as like a large government space program. But agencies allow you, from a government perspective, to start allocating funds towards education, awareness building, in many instances towards development of relevant and appropriate applications in your particular regions. So I think these are really important structures that enable this. We have currently, I think it's around 58 satellites operating as a continent, which is, admittedly small in the global scale, but it's not small if you exclude SpaceX as like the real outlier in this region, in this industry. And if you look at the number of new space companies alone, we're probably sitting at well over 300 new space companies that exist in Africa. And we're not talking about the application space. If you start thinking about the number of GIS professionals, for example, who are utilizing a lot of this data, then you're sitting in the thousands. From an industry perspective number, we are on the way towards hitting kind of $20 billion. We don't know what the most recent numbers are, but it's on the order of $20 billion, which is around about 3 to 4% of the global space budget, of about half a trillion dollars. So the numbers are growing. And I think what we are starting to see, as for example, groups like Starlink continue to expand operations in the region. Vodafone is in kind of conversations with Amazon around Project Paper. So these numbers are going to start scaling up significantly as we, just as the local industry matures more.
Yeah, thanks. I'll still ask that question, but I'll rephrase it slightly. Usually, I like using the African Space Policy and Strategy as my reference when I'm discussing issues about the African Space Program. Excuse me. If you look at that document, there are 4 priority areas. That's Earth observation, satellite communication, navigation, position, and astronomy. And if touch on this slightly, so like Earth observation, you mentioned GMES in Africa. I think you mentioned Digital Earth Africa at some point. The issue of satellite communication, I know you touched slightly on SpaceX and what SpaceX is doing right now in Africa. I'm not sure you touched on navigation and positioning. In astronomy, I know you touched on SKA. So in terms of impact in each of these priority areas, what's going on? What is the impact? How are these sectors developing? Yeah.
So maybe let's give like a really clear example out of telecommunication, partly because like I know the numbers, and when I was having a conversation with the team at Angola Space Office. So Angola, established their own telco data satellite. They were the approximate numbers that they were kind of speaking about as a justification for this is that even though that putting up that satellite was, on the order of, hundreds of millions of dollars to put up the satellite, their annual data cost in leasing satellites from other providers was annually higher than the total mission cost for putting their own satellite up. So when you look at like a 3 or a 5 year or 7 year payback period, for example, you've saved hundreds, like almost to the tune of like $1 billion by utilizing these technologies. And I think that's the kind of comparison that we need to think about, which is, ownership, not always, but in many instances, ownership is a significantly more cost-effective mechanism for deriving these services. And in countries that have kind of very tight fiscal maneuvering space with significant development challenges, that becomes a very, very real conversation to have. And I think that these kinds of questions you find in all sorts of other areas. If you think about things like positioning, one of the challenges that we have that we're aware of is, for example, around illegal fishing. So if you look at like all of your blue economy work around the continent, there is significant illegal fishing that takes place. So how do you build a better AIS system? How do you understand how to kind of make sure and keep track of these kind of like navigational questions? Never mind like really important questions around like last mile delivery services. So we've seen a general trend across much of Africa towards increased delivery-based services. But this is really difficult to achieve if you don't have an address that you can send a package to or a parcel to and no other mechanism to give it to them. So, solving for some of these issues are not just important in themselves, but they unlock significant value chains in retail, in agriculture, and a whole bunch of other areas. A simple problem that I remember talking to some mining companies about many years ago is they're unaware of the position of their ore, like railway trucks, when they move from Zambia to South Africa, because there's no like positioning capability for this. So it could take 4 weeks to move from, northern Zambia to Richards Bay or Mozambique, or it could take 6 weeks. They just have no idea. And again, this is very much a location-based kind of solution. On the science side of things, I think that this is always a difficult kind of debate to have when you are weighing up kind of complex development issues of why and how should you be undertaking basic research that doesn't necessarily have an immediate socioeconomic benefit. I think that there are a couple of answers to that. One is these things are never either or, right? There's always a way to balance both of these. The other aspect is that, firstly, these things are almost always done through a kind of like larger partnerships. So there's a leveraging effect that you gain from being able to do this, building up these kinds of like international relationships and partnerships, but also, beyond the really important element of just like creating a space for people to be inspired about doing science or whatever the case may be, the technology capability that you build in developing a foundational basic science platform are themselves applicable in industrial development. So, it is very difficult to establish, for example, early stage technology startups if you don't have the basic research that feeds into those early startups. So it's really important to think of this as a knowledge value chain. And if you're missing one part of that value chain, the entire thing is going to collapse. So when you look at, the observatories that exist, they are critical components of a holistic education profile for the region.
Yeah, thanks, Davis. Maybe if I come down, if you look at the priority areas, if you come down, then you have what's called the supporting initiatives. And if you take it one after the other, let's start with infrastructure. Also looking at it at the national level and at the continental level. And it's a question from Natasha specifically about the South African government's initiative for the Space Infrastructure Hub, as it was called. There was an announcement for over about 5 billion rand to set up the Space Infrastructure Hub. And she's asking what's the current status of that initiative and what's going on. So if you want to respond to that, but in addition to that, also look at infrastructure, maybe citing in other countries like Kenya, Nigeria, and of course, from the African Union perspective also, if you know what, I know you mentioned the African Space Agency, the building is ready. I'm not sure. I know there's a plan to start getting it operational maybe from this year, but we'll see how that goes. But in terms of infrastructure, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. So I think I want to talk about like two types of infrastructure. So one is actual physical hard infrastructure, and the other one is the networking infrastructure that exists. So firstly, specifically, Natasha, to your question, my understanding is that the Space Infrastructure Hub received go-ahead at the beginning, towards the end of last year, beginning of this year, and that will go into South Africa's financial budgeting process, which I believe starts in April. And they will, and SANS, the South African National Space Agency, will break ground on this Space Infrastructure Hub. So the figure was about $300 million US. That kind of fluctuates, but the 300 million is the one that normally sort of sticks in my head. You asked a question there specifically about ZASpace. So for those who may not know, ZASpace is kind of aspires to be the industry representative body for the South African space sector. And they are kind of working with and trying to support SANZA to get this over the line. You ask if RIIS has any relationship. No, we are not involved, other than being a supporter of the space sector in general. We don't have any kind of direct connections there. But I want to come back to ZASpace because this speaks to the network infrastructure that is being built. So one of the important things that we've seen is it is very difficult for government as a collective to interact with individual companies at an industry level. So you need some sort of intermediary to work between the sector that is trying to drive something and the government. Now, ideally, if the government has an agency in place or some other representative body, you can have one-to-one interactions to help drive drive the right policy, to kind of garner support for the sector and so on. But when you don't have any collective voice, it becomes very difficult to persuade the public sector that there is a common kind of goal for anything. And what I think is quite exciting is that we've seen over the last few years, particularly last year, kind of like the real kind of blossoming of a number of space sector industry bodies across the continent. So the two that I've been sort of keeping a close eye on, one is MISI, which is the Moroccan Industry for Space Initiative, and the other one is TUNSA, the Tunisian National Space Association. So both of these are essentially private sector bodies that are acting as representatives to have engagement with government. And they're really having sort of significant success. TUNSA, for example, raised over €1 million towards the end of last year to help develop some great technology in Tunisia at the kind of private sector level. So this networking infrastructure is really important for people to build, and having that kind of group, I think, is an important evolution of local space ecosystems. The physical infrastructure, I'd mentioned briefly that Egypt has established an assembly integration and testing facility. I think this is a really important milestone for the continent. There are continued discussions here in Kenya, for example, about the kind of various ground stations that exist. And I know that there are active conversations with many people, not necessarily at the space agency, around the establishment of launch capabilities in Kenya. Of course, Kenya and Tanzania are pretty much ideal locations because equatorial east-facing coast is your kind of like most kind of cost and fuel efficient mechanism to reach orbits. So there's a lot of this kind of infrastructure development that is being considered. My view is that infrastructure remains a very difficult conversation to have in the region because it is ultimately expensive and that needs to be funded somehow. And capital is, although there is no shortage of money, and we always tell people that money is not the problem, it's convincing people with the money to give it to you that's the problem. That it's a hard sell to justify that when we don't have all the other pieces in the ecosystem at play. So, if we were to build, I'm just going to off the top of my head, but if we were to build a spaceport in Kenya, do we have the thousands of engineers in place that can help service that? And what is our timeline for producing the human capital to support the physical infrastructure? Do we have the industrial value chains to support that? So it's very difficult to build one component of the value chain if the other kind of components are still further apart. And so from my point of view, I think that the physical infrastructure is going to take some time to resolve. And, the human capital side, the downstream application area, those are things that we can certainly progress faster.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for mentioning some of the initiatives. I mean, like Tunsa that you mentioned, I think they also got a grant, I think early this year from Europe Horizon. They got some money to do some work. They're really doing great here. I'll still ask one more question regarding infrastructure. Maybe not the large-scale infrastructure, like South Africa trying to build a space infrastructure hub. Egypt has a project to build what they call Space City. And I think Sudan, if not because of the crisis, I know they also had a plan to build something like a space city also. They made the announcement some years ago. But in terms of smaller infrastructure, which could be useful, especially for companies, new space companies, so like incubators, like accelerators, we don't hear much of that. I don't know. You are in the industry, and this is one of the things you do. Can you give us an idea of what's going on in that sphere?
Sure. So maybe two aspects. So one, there's an important kind of like data infrastructure that needs to be accessible. And if you think of groups such as Digital Earth Africa, which is building this, continent-wide data cube that is providing free resources to scientists and policymakers and entrepreneurs to develop new solutions, I think that data infrastructure is critical. Because you as an individual may not have access or kind of easy access to the complexity of data that exists and which we need access to. So I think that there is a lot of data access that is being developed. I know Digital Earth Africa has partnerships, for example, with AWS. So it's a really kind of robust platform. If we think about this from an entrepreneur or startup perspective, I think that the startup ecosystem across the continent is still at a relatively early stage of development. And so we see relatively few industry-specific accelerator and incubator programs. So there has been some specifics, particularly in the fintech and financial sector, but that's because, at least half of all VC in Africa goes towards fintech. So there's sufficient kind of capital going in to justify industry verticals. Space, however, has is not yet large enough to justify its own vertical kind of industry accelerator programs. Now, there is a really interesting question around whether or not you should think of this in terms of space, or you want to just build, for example, a climate change startup, which happens to use space services. But even there, and there are some climate-focused accelerators, they don't have a strong space technical background. So I think that one of the really big opportunities that we've been seeing is how do you build a virtual incubation acceleration program that can either be scaled into existing hubs and accelerator programs, and there are hundreds of those across the continent, but can also potentially provide a kind of virtual mentorship and acceleration program to address kind of startups from across the region. But this is a big gap, and what we've seen is that existing accelerators and hubs don't have that specific technical capability.
Yes. Well, if you want to speak, you're just welcome to raise your hand, and then I give you the opportunity to speak. Otherwise, you can just put your questions on the chat box. Another component of the ecosystem, looking at that policy and strategy, is international partnerships, which you touched on. There were a couple of activities that came up last year. Angola, towards the end of the year, signed the U.S. Artemis Accords, making it the third country to do that. You touched on the Africa-UK Space Tour, which hints at a possibility of some closer collaboration between the UK and Africa. And if you look at the chat box, there's a question about China. Someone's asking about China. Can you provide a bit of information on the size and magnitude of Chinese engagement in Africa, both from public and private sector? So you may want to respond to that, but also look at, apart from China, other potential partners. So the AU has some statutory partners. So it has India, it has the EU, of course, US, even though it has not been very strong until recently. And then the Arab Africa Cooperation. It has Japan as a very strong partner. And of course, China, definitely. So from international partnerships, what did you observe last year? What was the impact?
Sure.
How beneficial was it to Africa? And any other thoughts you have?
Yeah. So I think that one of the starting points here is that we need to recognize that there are 54 countries in Africa which vary in their kind of like geopolitical positioning and aspirations. And as a result of that, there are many different partnerships in different directions. And those are all aligned with whatever their national sort of government priorities are. So we've seen, for example, that there are kind of great relationships. So as you mentioned, with Artemis Accords, we have Rwanda, Angola, and Nigeria. But China has been a really important player, not just in the space sector, but also with a number of other countries from a trade and a development perspective. So, Egypt, for example, has a very strong relationship with China, has been supporting that in many different ways. And so, I don't have specific numbers into how many or kind of like what the size of these investments are. But you see that there are strong relationships with this. I'd mentioned earlier that Roscosmos has a relationship with Sansa, and that there's been some great scientific exchange programs. So what we're seeing is that there are very, very active international partnerships that are emerging. Another important element of this that I think we will see more of in the coming year is around BRICS. So, particularly with Ethiopia joining, with Saudi joining, this kind of space community within BRICS is likely to be enhanced. And a region that you hadn't explicitly mentioned is the Middle East, right? So what is the work that Saudi and the UAE is doing in supporting various African kind of agencies? So we're definitely seeing more and more of these international collaborations. I mean, I'd mentioned Digital Earth Africa earlier. They're actually supported by Geosciences Australia. So there's an extensive kind of global network that we're seeing. And I think that all of these programs are helping to enrich knowledge activities within the region, but importantly, are helping to change the understanding of the African space program in all of these other regions. And I think it's just as important to shift people's understanding elsewhere in the world as it is to shift people's understanding here in Africa.
Yeah, international partnership is important, but equally important is intra-African partnership. That's partnership within African countries. Yeah, you touched on the BRICS, which is one area I'm kind of interested in. I'm going to kind of monitor to see what happens space cooperation within the expanded BRICS. Like you mentioned, so Egypt is now a member. Egypt from North Africa. Ethiopia is also a member from East Africa. South Africa from Southern Africa. So I don't know whether that's actually a strategic arrangement. So maybe now have somebody from West Africa, possibly Nigeria, because they talk about Nigeria coming in, and then so there's kind of like a spread. But your thoughts about intra-African cooperation, right? I mean, like you were formerly in South Africa, but now you're now based in Kenya. So that movement, you'll be able to see something. And your work with the African Earth Observation Challenge also, and of course with RIIS. So it gives you a picture of what's going on within Africa. And the African Space Agency, I mean, from the plan, is supposed to leverage or build on the capabilities and the contributions of the member states. So what's the status of intra-African cooperation right now? Is it improving?
It's I think that there is a lot of great relationships at an agency level. And certainly, the establishment of the African Free Trade Agreement is going to, drive a lot of that interaction over time. I think at this stage, the actual trade at a private sector level is not what it could be. I think that there is a significant opportunity for the African private space industry to service the needs of space consumers across Africa. So we have the capabilities, for example, to build our own constellations and sell that into the African market. But that hasn't been, that question hasn't been solved yet. So I think that while there is bilateral and multilateral support across the region, we have yet to solve the real trade agreement, which is ultimately where it ends up being valuable to citizens and consumers and entrepreneurs when they're able to sell across border. But that is a problem that hasn't, in my view, been solved as yet.
Before I pivot to what to expect this year, there's just one more thing I want to ask about human capital. And this is really important because the AU theme for this year has to do with education, skills development, human capital development. And in fact, the ASLI colloquium coming up in May also is kind of focusing on that. Especially from an industry perspective, what do you see as the state of skills? What skills gaps are you still observing? And what are your thoughts? Go ahead.
Yeah. So I'm going to kind of put this into three main buckets. So there's academic skills, private sector, and then public sector. I think that, one of the challenges that we're facing is that there are there are relatively few engineering programs across the continent that enable space-focused technical skills. So there is some aeronautical engineering, there is some mechanical and sort of electrical engineering that takes place in a few hotspots around the continent. But it's certainly not enough to grow an industry, right? So just as an example of what is possible elsewhere, a colleague who runs a space tech startup in Germany in 3 years has gone from 0 to 60 or 70 engineers, on the payroll building out their startup. I'm hesitant that you would be able to find 60 or 70 engineers without completely, draining the engineering pool in a country like South Africa related to space. And that's just like one startup, and there are, hundreds. So there are a limited number of these technical capabilities producing engineers. And I think that it's not such a major problem today because we have a relatively small industry, but it's going to be incredibly difficult to grow the sector if there is no one to employ in that sector. So that's kind of one challenge. The other challenge from an education or academic perspective is that there are, to my knowledge, there are no non-engineering space studies programs across the continent. So previously, at least UCT in South Africa had a space studies master's and MPhil program. But for people who are interested in space law or the economics of space, or anything outside of these core engineering, like where do they go? And you can't build an industry only with engineers. I think they are important, but you need someone who can argue about space law, right? You need people who are able to talk about what does an industrial value chain look like in the space sector, which is an economics question. You need to understand the HR components in the sector. So, we're missing this bigger value chain question, the business of space. Like, there are no business schools in Africa that touch on what it is like to be a space entrepreneur. So, are we teaching new MBA students about the opportunities that exist in space? Right? So there's a bunch of big academic gaps that I think exist. The second I kind of mentioned about the private sector, there is no shortage of really remarkable technical capabilities, everywhere, across the continent. And I think that there is a lot of on-the-job in-house training that is done. But I think that, again, it comes back to this question of if we are producing, engineers and, technicians in this area, but are not able to provide them with viable employment, they're going to go elsewhere. And so we lose that talent. And so, we really need to find ways of addressing this kind of not just the talent production gap, but the talent absorption gap, which is on the private sector side. The last component that I just want to touch on briefly is around public sector, which is to say, I don't think it's important, within reason, that the public sector have technical skills related to space, but I think it is incredibly important for them have a greater awareness of the value that space-based services can provide of citizen outcomes and benefits. And so, ensuring that that a public official or a civil servant understands the value of space is a really important education and awareness building process that will unlock all sorts of great conversations from the public sector elsewhere.
Wow, great. So one of the things that we are looking at doing at ASLI, because this skills issue is something that we are really concerned about. One of the spin-offs from this Africa Space Tour was we had a contact through the how is it called? Satellite Applications Catapult. We had a contact with it's called Space Skills Alliance in the UK. So ASLI wants to work with them to see how we can. So they do this skills audit for the UK Space Agency. So only so that we can do that for Africa. One of the points you mentioned is something which is actually touching directly on the mission of ASLI, which is those knowledge and skills that are non-science, non-engineering. So like you mentioned, space law, space business. Those are the things that ASLI is trying to address through the courses which we actually organize. And in fact, either today or tomorrow, we are going to announce the space policy course for this year. For space law, we are going into partnership with a renowned university. The announcement should come up either this year or either this week or next week to organize some courses on space law. But I don't want to mention the university yet because I've seen one of the colleagues here. On space business, I know we've had the discussion to explore what RIIS and ASLI could do with respect to something around training on space business or strategy or something. And I think we can go on with that discussion later. So, generally, ASLI hopes to kind of contribute in filling that gap, and hopefully can also work with some other institutions like RIIS and other organizations that may be interested. So let's pivot a bit and let's look at, we've been talking 2023, let's talk 2024 now. It's already mid-year. And generally, what new developments do you see? What things do you see in the horizon this year?
So I think that we are going to see an increase in the number of, from the private sector, the number of space tech startups who are raising capital. I think that there's a lot of new visibility that we're seeing coming in. I think that there are growing venture capital ecosystems across the continent. And so, I think that there are going to be, 2024 into 2025, a real growth in the startup ecosystem, which I think is really important. I think that there are a number of application or kind of infrastructure developments that are going to unlock significant opportunities. So you look at data services like Starlink. There's groups such as Airbridge that are providing kind of satellite GSM backhaul support. So I think that there's a lot of infrastructure that is going to be developed that might not be obvious at the consumer end, but that is really enhancing the adoption of space technologies in opening up a lot of these different areas. I think we're going to continue to see a development of kind of international relationships. I don't have any prior knowledge, but I will not be surprised if there are some more people signing on to Artemis Accords. But I think that there is going to be a significantly stronger set of relationships with the Middle East. So my expectation is that that corridor, particularly into the UAE and Saudi, is going to be particularly strengthened over the coming year. So those are a couple of high-level thoughts for where things are going. Other things will take time. The development of other hard infrastructure is a slow process. So we'll see movement, but not necessarily activation. So that's kind of a couple of main thoughts that I have.
The startup ecosystem which you mentioned, which the top 3 countries or 5 countries should we look out for in terms of investment?
Yeah, so Kenya, Egypt are the top 2. After that, I'm going to say it's going to be difficult to sort of guess where it's going to be. Obvious answers are Nigeria and South Africa, but they're both having sort of major challenges around their kind of startup environment. It will not surprise me if we see some great tech startups coming out of the Tunisian ecosystem. At the beginning of last year, there was a remarkable exit by the DeepMind team. I think that might start coming into play this year. But yeah, Kenya and Egypt. I think those are the two interesting places.
I was expecting you to mention Rwanda.
I think that Rwanda is doing a significant amount of work, but ultimately to build a viable startup ecosystem requires significant talent. And I think that Rwanda is still quite early in its journey for building out local talent that can work in a sector. This is just purely a numbers game. There are, if you think about a place like Kenya, there are hundreds of engineers that are being produced, by the universities on an annual basis. There's like a large influx of, it's a hub in their region. And the population is 20 times larger than Rwanda. So, ultimately, if you want to have 100 companies employing 10, space engineers, you need 1,000 engineers, and those need to come from somewhere. And so I think that it's, the work that they're doing is excellent. I've seen that they've just announced that the UNDP's Global Innovation be hosted out of Kigali as part of the Kigali International Finance Center, which is a remarkable achievement. But ultimately, you need human capital. And if you're not producing enough local human capital, it's going to put a constraint on what you can do in the sector. So, that's why I think, at least at this stage, the more mature ecosystems that have larger populations, larger talent pools, are going to be the regions that drive the ecosystem in the next year, 2 years. Like that, of course, might change dramatically over the next 5 years. But at least for now, from a startup perspective, Kenya, Egypt, and to a lesser extent, South Africa, Nigeria, because they just have so much momentum behind them, that they'll continue to play that role in the immediate future.
On a continental level, I know one of the topmost things that will be on the mind of the African Union Commission is to get the African Space Agency running. If you may advise, what top 3 issues would you advise the AUC to kind of focus on this year, which kind of will make like a reverberating impact across the ecosystem?
Yeah. Awareness is one, right? And awareness within the public sector of the value of space. If they are able to help convince more African governments to procure services from space kind of companies, I think that is unlocking an enormous kind of value chain for African space firms. So awareness building within government is one aspect. The second is helping to address this human capital challenge. It is that might be a long-term problem to solve, but it is very difficult to establish an entrepreneurial kind of startup ecosystem without talent, and it's difficult to grow the ecosystem without talent. And I one of the reasons that we focus so much on the idea of like an entrepreneurial ecosystem is, practically speaking, there are no space ecosystems or space value chains in most countries in Africa. And so by definition, if you establish a new industry, it is entrepreneurs who are establishing that industry. And so you need to take an entrepreneurial viewpoint from an industrial value chain kind of perspective. So entrepreneurs ultimately need to hire people, which means that they need talent. And so the human capital component is the second thing apart from awareness building. And I think that those 2 issues are foundational for everything else that matters, right? You can talk about, pathways to scale businesses. You can talk about access to finance, like all of those things are true. But if you don't have buy-in and you don't have talent, none of the rest will make a difference.
Interesting. Uh, what are the top three things on your plate right now? And of course, by extension, on the plate of RIIS.
Yeah, sure. So, one, we're very keen on continuing to work with our partners in the Africa EO Challenge to kind of scale that program up. So we as RIIS are one of about 20 partners in the challenge. And certainly the more that we can, encourage entrepreneurs to move into space as a kind of destination for their competence, the better. So that for us is, I think, a really important thing. You can go check it out at eochallenge.africa. The new challenge will launch in a few months, and is really like a flagship entrepreneurial kind of program particularly for the application sector in space. So that's an important element. The other kind of just set of topics and conversations that we think is really important to drive is the view that you need to take an economic development perspective to building space ecosystems and agencies. So one of the things that we've found is many of the agencies that have been established in Africa, but this is a comment about most of them kind of globally, is they are very often engineering led. And I think that was 100% appropriate in a time when space programs were driven by the public sector. But as we move into a new space environment where the private sector plays a much more important role, you need to take an industrial, trade and industry perspective on the space value chain. And so the inclusion of economic development, of industrial economics into the design of your value chains, I think is a really important shift in the mindset of agency leadership. And that is a message I think that we're going to sort of continue to promote, that we need to think about this not as a public program, but how do we build a viable private sector industry? And that requires a shift in thinking away from the past to this kind of new space environment. So those are the two kind of like real things. And then the third element is wherever we can, inspiring and encouraging people to interact with each other. So supporting things like SGAC, getting more young people into the sector, and just like, getting people excited about space. Like, it's not difficult to get people excited about space because space is cool.
Yeah.
But you just need to make sure that people understand that space is also for them. And I think that's a really important kind of message we want to get out.
Just my final question has to do with Africa's place when it comes to global governance, space governance. This year, a very important program is coming up. That's the UN, how's it called? UN Summit of the Future. It's an initiative by the UN Secretary General, and they've been having development over the past couple of years. And the summit is coming up this year in September. And of course, a very key component has to do with space, specifically space sustainability issues, that's space safety, space security. What role do you see Africa playing? What role can we play? How can we position ourselves so that we can kind of contribute or be part of the discourse on global space governance?
I think it's a really important question. So one of the kind of phrases that we've been using a lot is the idea of like this orbital divide, right? Past, there was an idea of a digital divide, where many people across the world did not have access to the internet. And I think that there is a very real risk that if we do not actively raise our voice and create space for ourselves, there will people across emerging countries, emerging space nations, do not have access to space in the same way that more industrialized countries do. And so this idea of an orbital divide is, I think, critical for us to solve. We do not want to be locked out of the future space economy in any way. So I think that there is, in terms of this conversation, one, I don't believe that there should be permission seeking in any way. Like, we are an active participant in this process. We are providing access to the resources, the talent, in future, potentially, like the actual geography that enables space to be a viable area. And I think that we need to go into that conversation with a very clear understanding of what we want, and how that will add value into the broader kind of value chain. I think that it needs to be done and we need to play a constructive role from a kind of position of being a peer, because in this future space economy, no one has won, right? No one has succeeded at new space, right? We are all at the same kind of, playing field. So yes, other countries have, clearly won old space, but we're in a different game now. And I think that we are equally capable of, operating at the same level as elsewhere. And that's kind of the role that we should be playing.
Well, thanks so much, Davis, for your thoughts and insights. And in fact, Natasha has nicely summarized the discussion. And I'll just read what she put out there, that the prevailing theme all through the discussion, the talk, has been issue around capability. So human capacity development, education, skills development. And she cites examples there: knowledge, skills, models, benchmarks, empowerment, standards. And I think that nicely captures the whole discussion that we need to build capabilities in knowledge, build skills, build models, from the industry perspective, from government perspective, organizations, and even individuals will have roles to play in all this. So it's been quite interesting. Thanks so much for your thoughts. Thanks for your insights. And thanks for honoring the invitation also. And thanks to everyone who has been part of this discussion and staying up to the end. So I think we'll have to stop at this time, and hopefully we'll have another opportunity to engage with Davis again to share his great insights. And please don't forget to check out the African Earth Observation Challenge when it's announced. And of course, look out for ASLI announcement on the space courses. I think today the announcement for the space policy course should be out. You're welcome to join, and then other courses will come up later in the year. So thanks everyone, and hope to see you again sometime soon.